Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. The last few weeks, we have been developing the storyline of what happened in the buildup of the Pequot War. We've developed the players and are now working through the events as they occurred. The early years of the 1630s saw the Pequots at their peak. They were the power brokers of the southern New England natives, and they had a lot, and they would lose it all in 5 years. We started with the beginning of hostilities between the Dutch and the Pequots, and then that escalated with the Pequots and the Narragansetts. And during these early years of growing unrest, the Puritans had also discovered the great value of Connecticut. They'd been encouraged by the Pequots to settle there and quickly outflanked the Dutch. And it wasn't just the Dutch. Puritan Massachusetts Bay also outflanked their English brethren at Plymouth and soon had several permanent settlements. The real trouble came to the Pequots as a three-headed monster. And first of all, the smallpox epidemic hit them hard. And second of all, about the same time, their main sachem, Tadobim, had been killed by the Dutch. And this created a power vacuum, or a power challenge, within the Pequot nation, just when they needed leadership and unity the most. We haven't developed that aspect yet, but we will in the next few weeks. And then thirdly, beginning with the killing of John Stone, they had attracted the ire of Massachusetts Bay, and they couldn't shake it. Suddenly, the Pequots were without allies or reliable trading partners. They were being blamed for things beyond their control and only through the lens of European diplomacy and civility, not Algonquin. Ultimately, they were to be held responsible for the death of John Oldham, an English trader, even though he had been killed by Easter Niantics. They were tributaries of the Narragansetts, not the Pequots. As a matter of fact, they were Pequot enemies. The whole thing just seems like a ruse to gain their lands. There was nothing they could do to avoid the trouble that was brewing, trouble that was being devised in Boston. As we ended our time last week, we said in part, quote, "The confusion around the why or whys would not seem so weird to me, but for one thing. The official record of Massachusetts General Court, as recorded by author William Hubbard, states this, that they knew the murder of John Oldham took place on Block Island, and they knew Block Island natives were tributaries of the Narragansetts. It also states, quote, the Pequots treacherously and cruelly murdered Captain Stone, and in treacherous-like manner slew one Mr. Oldham, end quote. The guilty parties had fled to the Pequots for protection, thus, in the English eyes, causing their guilt. Some question if that was even true. Some question if they knew it not to be true even back then. But at any rate, the Massachusetts Bay Gang had one more reason to justify war against the Pequots. What did John Winthrop know? Why are there no public records of interviews or evidence? There's just the indictment of the Pequots. How do you like that? Knowing what we know now about the bigger picture. End quote. So it was that the murders of Captain Stone and John Oldham were still not satisfactorily resolved from an English perspective, from a Puritan, Massachusetts Bay, Boston perspective. Plans were made to do just that, resolve both situations to English satisfaction. Now, between these two high-profile murders, the English were beginning to suspect conspiracy. They were beginning to think that there was an all-out assault on them in the works from all the natives. They were not going to simply sit around and wait to be attacked. They prepared for an offensive. They were growing distrustful of all of the natives. Now, official records of the time reveals that they believed they'd secure their peace, quote, by killing the barbarians, end quote. They came to the conclusion that an aggressive offensive would scare the natives into submission. It's a great way to extend friendship, isn't it? The problem in these times is that they were more than willing to operate outside the bounds of their charter and the acceptable expectations and norms of their own society across the Atlantic. We'll talk a little bit about that later. As we've made mention in the past, many of these actions and events seem to have coincided with quote-unquote lost or unkept records. I mean, it sounds vaguely contemporary, doesn't it? Some big questionable thing happens in the political arena and all of a sudden the records are lost or they're cloudy or they're put into jeopardy or they're put into question. And we'll get another taste of that in the next couple of weeks. So keep in mind, Captain Stone was not exactly a nice guy. I mean, by every measure, he was trouble, a scoundrel. The Puritans and the Pilgrims hated him. I mean, if you're going to provoke a situation coming to someone's defense, it seems like it would be a little more believable, your interest in justice, if the object of your retribution had an ounce of upstandedness. But alas, the Johnstone incident was the excuse the Puritan leadership used to provoke the people who occupied the land they coveted. They knew there was only really one group that they had to please as they proceeded, and that was the clergy. They used the more recent murder of the more respectable John Oldham for this. They received the blessing toward, quote, doing justice upon the Indians for the death of Mr. Oldham, end quote. They were confident in the Lord's blessing upon a punitive raid. English reciprocity. Now first, keep that in mind, a punitive raid, payback. Reciprocity. You remember we talked about the Algonquin idea of reciprocity, the concept that payment or repayment for an offense was justified. But the repayment was just that, a form of replacement, not overpayment nor total destruction. So the concept that the Puritan leadership sold was like punishment for damage incurred. In this case, English life. I mean, what should a punitive raid look like in that instance? What would reciprocity actually look like, reasonably, in this situation? Now, keeping that train of thought in mind, let's define what the magistrates in Massachusetts Bay meant by English reciprocity towards the natives for the death of a few traders, some of which were quite questionable in their own character. Their plan was to dispatch a force of 90 men, first to Block Island, and then to the Pequot village at the mouth of the Pequot River. At Block Island, they were to take possession of the island, kill all the males, and enslave the women and children. Now, since this was a volunteer force, which was cheap for Massachusetts Bay to actually obtain their objective, the booty collected was to be the pay for the soldiers. So here's a question. What kind of incentive do you think that gave them? Sent with the admonition of the magistrates, the blessing of the clergy, and the promise of wealth for the taking. Just kind of setting the tone here, right? So in Pequot country, they were to demand again the murderers of Captain Stone, collect 1,000 fathoms of wampum, that's an obnoxious amount that could never reasonably be expected to be paid, and take some Pequot children as hostages to ensure future good behavior. The children could be voluntarily handed over, or if need be, taken by force. So that's the English idea of a punitive raid, of reciprocity. How does that sit with you from the outset? The leader of the expedition was John Endicott. He was a poor choice if you were looking for a solution, for a remedy to the problem, even a harsh one. He was a well-known man who had served in various capacities throughout Massachusetts Bay. They knew who they tapped for their mission. Now, if you wanted to carefully navigate the narrow aisles of a China store, let's say, would you send an angry bull to do the job? Would you use a pickaxe as a toothpick? John Endicott was known as an impatient man and a man prone to violence. He had preceded the great Puritan immigration that began in 1630 by just a few years, and he had first settled in what would later become Salem. He had been instrumental in uniting the young colony in security. Guy Chet put it this way: Massachusetts Bay was much better equipped and prepared for war than was Plymouth. During the early 1630s, the Court of Assistance in Boston enacted and enforced legislation designed to provide the various settlements with mutual support and capable defenders. Frontier communities, such as Dorchester and Watertown, were required to establish nightly watches. Weekly drills were made mandatory for all militia units. Stiff penalties were imposed on absentees from training and watch duty. All citizens were instructed to equip themselves with a musket, 1 pound of powder, 20 bullets, and 2 fathoms of match, serpentine. Towns were authorized to impress men into service for purposes of security, and travelers on the frontier were forbidden to travel alone or unarmed. To complement these defensive preparations, a beacon was constructed in Boston in 1635 to be fired in case of attack by land or sea, hence the name Beacon Hill. The court involved itself heavily in matters of security. No other issue received as much attention. In 1634, every town was instructed to appoint an overseer of powder and shot. The sale of arms and ammunition to Indians was strictly forbidden and had been since the Massachusetts Bay Company received its royal charter in 1629. Captain John Endicott, the resident agent of the New England Company, was instructed by the Massachusetts Bay Company to arrest offenders and send them to London for trial. Similarly, the First Connecticut General Court, convened in Hartford on April 26, 1636, forbade the sale of firearms and ammunition to Indians. End quote. That's an interesting passage on 2 fronts. The first one is for our immediate consideration right here with John Endicott, that the colonials in Massachusetts Bay, from the beginning, from very early on, were very interested in their own security. And they had enacted policies that led to the greater communal security of the group. And John Endicott oversaw that. But the second thing, and we won't get to this for quite some time in this series, but that's the same type of system that was utilized 140 years later when a man named Paul Revere rode through the countryside. So we see very early on, Massachusetts was very concerned about the security of all of the communities collectively. So John Endicott not only was intimately involved in the formation of communal security, he was a strong Puritan leader, even among strong Puritan leaders. Much like John Underhill, he had been controversial and willing to do the dirty work, the kinds of things that civilized societies don't want to know about. I mean, we need these guys, but they're best left to the shadows of history. Their contemporary chroniclers that frame popular history are usually quite willing to oblige once their service is rendered. John Endicott was not a soft man, even among his own. He had served as governor of Salem for a short time and managed to aggravate the non-Puritans. Now, at its inception, you've got to understand, Salem was a mixed population. It was not the Puritan bastion that Boston and the rest of Massachusetts Bay would be just a few years later. That's going to be a part of our storyline down the road when we develop Salem in about 60 years from our current time frame. So anyways, on one occasion in Salem, when he was acting as judge, John Endicott actually struck a defendant. And in 1631, he admitted that he had been, quote, too rash, end quote, in striking, quote, Goodman Dexter, end quote. Too rash in striking Goodman Dexter. He said that it was not until after this incident that he had learned that it was not lawful for a justice of the peace to strike. What a crock. He continued, quote, but if you had seen the manner of his carriage, with such daring of me with his arms in kembo, it would have provoked a very patient man, end quote. He demanded the cross be cut from the royal flags displayed in New England. He was a ruthless persecutor of Quakers and other dissenters. I mean, you get the idea then of what kind of a man this was. I'm not totally discrediting him. I'm just illustrating who he was. I mean, drawing the proper picture of who the magistrates thought should lead their 90-man army into the wilds of Connecticut to exact punitive raids on the native groups who had done them wrong. Well, had done some traitors wrong. The Puritan leadership loved John Endicott. At the time of the Block Island expedition, he was serving as an assistant to the governor. Later, he would serve as both deputy governor and governor of the Bible State itself. Edward Johnson, a Puritan historian, hailed him as, quote, the honored, much-desired servant of Christ, end quote. So, led by Endicott, the group's chain of command looked like this. Captains John Underhill, who we spent several weeks developing, and Nathaniel Turner, and they were assisted by ensigns Davenport and Jennison. Now, for 90 men, they seemed awful top-heavy. Underhill rationalized and defended the necessity by noting the native way of warfare first. That is to divide and attack in smaller groups. He said that the expedition needed the flexibility to divide into smaller units as well. But he also added that scripturally, they were right in line with the Old Testament, where there were, quote, captains of hundreds, captains of thousands, captains of 15s, and captains of 10s, end quote. And they also had 2 native guides. And so it was on August 22nd, 1636, they set out in 3 pinnaces. And they arrived at Block Island as darkness set in. The water was rough and the landing was dangerous. Now, from the vessels, they saw only 1 native. And as Underhill recorded, quote, espied an Indian walking on the shore in a desolate manner, as though he had secured intelligence of our coming, end quote. Now, we're going to quote John Underhill a few times coming up, both in this episode and in the next one. First, because he offers us a first-hand account of what the English experienced. He's the man on the ground. But also because his account draws a different picture than the official account that the magistrates would tell. While they would later claim Pequot aggression and Puritan defense, Underhill recorded a Pequot reaction that was quite the opposite. Now, keep in mind as we continue the story that, frankly, the Pequots at this time, even in the face of superior English weapons, could have prevailed upon the English. They could have destroyed this expedition. That's my opinion. But with their numbers and abilities, I think they could have at least fended off this party. In the end, they would have faced overwhelming English numbers and superior firepower. So maybe it doesn't matter in the final analysis. But the English would get away with something on this trip that I find hard to understand. Maybe I'm wrong. So anyway, we will consider Underhill's observations along the way to gain a better sense of the atmosphere surrounding this small military force. But getting back to our story, what did the lone traveler along the shoreline mean? Some of the men thought that it meant that the natives had run at the threat of English aggression, while others thought there was an ambush waiting for them. The latter were correct. As it turns out, there were about 60 natives waiting for them in ambush. And this group seems to have represented the cream of the crop. They were described as physically imposing as a group. They were big and strong, young and healthy type. Against the backdrop of the strong waves and the coming nightfall, the first English ashore were met with a healthy dose of arrows. To Underhill's thinking, the goal had been to end the invasion before it even got a foothold. That would make sense to me. You gotta hand it to the English. Think about this scene. They were determined. This was no small act of bravery. Regardless of their mission or their rationale, this was a courageous move. I'd have wanted to stay on the pinnace. The rough waters prevented an easy, kind of quasi-amphibious landing. The men could not get stable footing to aim and shoot from the pinnaces. The pinnaces could not get close enough to shore for danger of breaking up in the rough waters. So Underhill ordered the men to jump into the water and wade ashore. Once ashore, they began to return the arrow fire with gunfire, and the natives quickly fled. As scary and dangerous as this scene was, there was only one injury. It was a non-fatal, albeit nasty wound. One of the men had been hit with an arrow in the neck, and the arrow went deep, but had been prevented from further entrance, from fatal entrance, by the thick collar around his neck. John Underhill also experienced what could have been a fatal injury. He credited his wife with saving his life. It seems that she made him take precautions that he would not have taken. Wives can do that. When my wife nags about something, really nags, there's a small voice inside of my head that more times than not tells me I should listen. It doesn't mean that I always listen. It just tells me that I should. It means that I recognize I should. And usually there's some wisdom in those warnings and exhortations. I also listen sometimes when she really nags, when she really gets something in her craw, just because I don't want to hear it after the fact either. But that's something that my wife and I work out. Anyway, John Underhill had this to say, quote, "If God had not moved the heart of my wife to persuade me to carry it along with me," and he was speaking of his helmet, "which I was unwilling to do, I'd have been slain," end quote. After the brief skirmish, the English quickly came ashore and made camp, and it was nighttime. Their fears of a night counterattack were never realized. It still must have been a scary ordeal out there like that. I mean, again, I know we're not talking about the Pequots yet. This was the home of the Easter Niantics. I still marvel that the natives, who had something to fight for, did not attack. It seems like they would have won. They certainly had home field advantage, and the enemy was pressed against the shoreline. I mean, even if they had traveled inland a little bit, it just seems like they could have been pushed off the island. I always marvel at how societies can allow themselves to be simply pushed aside from an outside force that, really, upon arrival at least, is vulnerable and susceptible to defeat at the hands of the host. Why would anyone allow this on their own soil if they had the power to stop it? Is it naivete? Is it ignorance? Disbelief? Stupidity? A complete lack of appreciation for home? Self or societal doubt? I mean, all of the above? Some of the above? I don't know. I just don't get it. I mean, I may be out of touch with the contemporary mindset or with the Easter Niantic mindset back then, but I am, admittedly with a little fear and trepidation, a total war guy. Like in most cases, once it becomes clear that diplomacy has failed or cannot work, once provoked, once threatened to a level beyond your ability to survive, you fight to win. You fight to throw off the aggressor. You fight to destroy them to the point that they don't come back. Those are the guys throughout history who live to frame the narrative. I mean, do you want to be a byword and a metaphor, or do you want to write a fantastic story? Frankly, this attitude does more to prevent conflict, in my opinion, than any other. If you know that's how the other guy is going to respond to you, it makes a would-be aggressor really count the cost. It creates a level of respect among people and people groups. Even the stronger will respect the weaker. I mean, it seems harsh because it is. The world is harsh. But at the end of the day, I don't give a crap if it's a game of checkers. I want to win. I realize that checkers is just checkers. But as the ante is upped in higher stakes games and the consequences escalated, so is the sobriety and the tenacity of the response. In my opinion, as it should be. Measured, calculated, going all in to avoid destruction. Secure preservation. In most cases, in this case, just like we're developing now. So at any rate, the Easter Niantics didn't counterattack that night. They allowed the English the room to come onto the island. The following morning, so day one, they began to spread out across the island, which was about 10 miles by 4 miles, in search of the enemy that they were tasked to destroy. The geography and the topography was not very hospitable. It was, quote, full of small hills and all overgrown with brushwood of oak, no good timber on it, end quote. The underbrush was so thick that the men were forced to travel single file along the native trails. To me, that in itself, that would have been a little nerve-wracking. If you're forced to walk single file through thick vegetation, you could have been attacked at any time. The island's villages were deserted, but they had been pretty well established. Each of the two large villages, located about 3 miles apart, contained 60 or more wigwams, and they were nicer than the mainland villages, so this was a nice place to live. They were also surrounded by 200 acres of corn, so food was plentiful. The corn was partially harvested at the time of Endicott's visit. The people had taken most of the possessions of value with them when they fled, so there wasn't a lot of booty to be had. A few baskets and mats, that's about it. As for the natives themselves, they had sought refuge in the swamps and were well hidden. There were a few sightings. Now, Captain Turner encountered some natives at the swamp's edge and fired on them. But remember, this was not a friendly mission. I mean, everybody was keenly aware of what was going on. Firing first and sorting it all out later made perfect sense. But you've got to feel for these natives here. Because if you'll remember, fearing English reprisal, the Narragansetts had already reprimanded these folks when Mayan Tomono visited them. The difference was that native justice was not out to utterly destroy the people in their villages. English justice was. So at any rate, Turner himself took an arrow in his armor, and he reported that the force made him feel as if he'd been pushed with a pike. Remember, these guys were far more medieval than we often associate them. So the idea of a pike was a good reference for a hard, blunt blow. And that kind of changes the simplistic view that we might take toward, native weapons. They were deadly. They had force to them. If the force of that arrow felt like a pike, that had to hurt. I don't care if you've got armor or not. Another interaction occurred when a resident native challenged the guides employed by the English to abandon the English and join the native cause. Sadly for him, that native was met with a fatal gunshot. So with no people readily available, really, en masse, for the planned death and destruction of English justice, they burned the wigwams in the fields and they destroyed several canoes. So the first night and the first day have passed. And on the second night, after reviewing the day's events and working through the disappointment of not being able to engage the enemy directly, the English decided that a night raid may yield dividends. What they figured was that the natives would return to their wigwams for the night, the ones that had not been burned. So it was that John Underhill took 10 men and went in search of wigwams. 2 miles down the trail, they found some. It was a large clearing with wigwams, corn, and, as they put it, great heaps of mats. The thought had occurred to Underhill to simply torch the whole thing as they slept. But then he changed his mind. He decided to return to the larger group and grab more men and attack first thing in the morning. The idea here was that it would help to kill more natives and they wouldn't get away. And if you recall from our series on the life of John Underhill, that this is a tactic that he would employ in the future many times over, burning people at night, beginning at Mystic in the very near future to our narrative. But at this time, he returned to his camp and rallied 40 men. And they did attack at first light, but found the village deserted. Imagine the anger here, the frustration. They had been up all night. They had been up all day the day before, and then they stayed up all night making these preparations. Maybe that's why he'd make a reputation for himself burning villages at night. He didn't want to lose the opportunity ever again. Besides, the terror that action evoked must have been overwhelming for anybody that felt they were his enemy. There's a psychological warfare going on with that as well. Most, even powerful warriors, aren't going to be that kind of deranged towards their enemies. So the village was empty, and the men, no doubt, enraged. They burned the wigwams in the fields, and they killed the dogs that had been left behind. If you can't kill people, you might as well kill their dogs, right? They located yet another village with more corn, but this village also had fruit, and they burned everything there too. This was the extent of the damage on Block Island. Basically, a lot of burned wigwams and crops, a few dead dogs and disabled canoes, but only one confirmed kill. Now, you can read different reports where they claimed to have killed more than this, but those are really unsubstantiated. Although the damage was devastating to the locals with their food and homes destroyed, there was not the loss of life that the English had been looking for. There was not the women and children that they had planned to take and sell into slavery. There was not the payday that these volunteers had been promised and expecting. After their inability to locate the native population, John Endicott made the decision to leave the island and continue on with his mission. The desired effect of utter destruction may not have come to fruition, but the outcome may have served a more advantageous purpose later for the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay, if not these volunteers. After this, the Block Island natives purchased English protection through annual payments of wampum. Isn't that what Massachusetts Bay was all about anyways? Gaining wealth, gaining control of the wampum? So with their work on the small island complete, they proceeded to Saybrook before moving into Pequot territory. And once again, Lion Gardner received the Massachusetts Bay men, but was furious when he heard their plan to provoke the Pequots yet again. He especially did not like the idea of taking the children hostage. He did not like the idea of attempting to extract a massive amount of wampum. I mean, it was too much. Frankly, he did not agree with the targeting of women and children at all. He wanted to see justice done, yes, but those plans were too much. And to this he said, quote, "You came hither to raise these wasps around my ears, and then you will take wing and fly away," end quote. I mean, basically, you're coming here to cause a problem that you don't have to deal with the consequences of. Furthermore, though, Gardner did believe that Saussicus would turn over the murderers of John Oldham if he had them in his custody. It wasn't just the physical threats of retaliation that made Lion Gardner's small fort so vulnerable. His other fear was more long-term. I mean, if the Pequots laid siege to Saybrook in anger or retaliation, they would also target the crops. And then the folks at Saybrook would face the very real danger of starvation as well. Gardner ordered the immediate harvest of their cornfields. When it became clear that he was not going to dissuade Endicott from his campaign, he played the role of pragmatist. If his corn harvest was to be threatened, he wanted the Pequot corn to be gathered when the soldiers engaged the village. That's actually pretty smart on his part. I mean, you're going to make the best of a bad situation. Endicott refused, but Gardner persisted. I mean, they had an argument is what happened. Gardner even offered to send his own men, bags for gathering the corn, and pinnaces to support their needs. He'd even hire the Dutch trader and his boat that was currently at Saybrook to navigate to the Pequot village and back. It was no skin off Massachusetts Bay's nose to just let him do that much. He even offered to share some of the corn with Massachusetts Bay. But Endicott still refused. Gardner persisted, and he began to plan anyways. And eventually, Endicott gave in and agreed to allow Gardner to gather the Pequot corn. That must have been an interesting exchange, though. I wonder who was there and what was actually said between these guys. What kind of temper did they display? So Gardner devised a simple plan. Again, remember, Gardner is like the Miles Standish. He's a military guy, but he's also the leader at Saybrook right now. So the responsibility and the onus really is on him, not just for the military security, but for the safety of all of the people when it comes to things, again, like eating. So he devised this simple plan. Once at the cornfield outside of the village, 8 men would stand guard while 4 men filled the sacks with corn. To me, that doesn't sound very efficient. It does sound very dangerous, but not very efficient. I mean, how much corn can 4 guys grab? How many sacks did they have? I'm trying to picture in my head, like, how big were these vessels that they were using? And how fast were those men going to go? And how big were these sacks? I mean, all these questions come to mind. How much would it really have been worth? At any rate, that was the plan. Now, they were delayed from leaving due to the weather for 4 days. But when that weather subsided, the Massachusetts Bay Troop, the men from Saybrook with their pinnace, and the Dutch trader all set off together for the main Pequot village at the mouth of the Pequot River, which was later renamed the Thames. And as they approached the Pequot village, they, the Pequots, were still ignorant of the English intentions. Although later accounts, official accounts, would record the Pequots started the trouble, that appears to be refuted by John Underhill's initial remarks at the time. He recorded that as they approached the village, quote, "The Indians spying came running in multitudes along the waterside, crying, 'What cheer, Englishmen? What cheer? What do you come for?' anticipating that they were there for trade." Boy, did that mood change quickly. What happened next must have made everybody's stomach turn. It must have made everybody's blood run cold, as the excitement was changed to confusion and dread very quickly. But that's a story for next time. And until then, I hope our time together this time has really made the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.